Welcome to this training series on employment equity offered by YWCA Canada, with support from the Government of Canada's Department of Women and Gender Equality and the Future Skills Centre. The way we work has changed. This requires managers to lead with emotional intelligence and empathy, and companies to think intentionally and creatively about their equity commitments and employee engagement. In this session, we will unpack some strategies for identifying and addressing subtle acts of exclusion, or microaggressions, and moving forward on bold steps to inclusion. Knowing how to have these conversations in an open and honest manner will assist individuals and organizations in recognizing and preventing microaggressions, allowing all employees to feel a sense of belonging. We do a land acknowledgement to honor the First People. We are acknowledging the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples in this area for time immemorial. In doing so, we also must recognize the harm that settler colonialism has perpetrated and continues to perpetrate on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As we engage online, let's remember that the digital spaces that we occupy are often used as a tool of oppression towards Indigenous women, racialized women, gender and sexual minorities, people with disabilities, and others who experience intersecting forms of marginalization. Let's do our best to create a space where we can all safely engage. For over 150 years, YWCA Canada has worked to advance gender equity by responding to urgent needs in communities through national advocacy and grassroots initiatives. Today, we engage young leaders, diverse communities, and corporate partners to collectively achieve our vision of a safe and equitable Canada for all. The information presented in this training module is rooted in the on-the-ground experiences of the YWCA Canada movement and reflects the needs, expertise, and wisdom of the women and gender diverse people served by YWCAs across Canada, a national leader in employment-focused programming, along with contemporary research from thought leaders in equity, inclusion, diversity, and justice in employment. Before we begin, let's review what's coming up. First, we will foreground microaggressions and subtle acts of exclusion based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, ability, language, and class, amongst others, that often occur at the workplace. Identifying and understanding them are the first steps to responding effectively. Then, we will cover some tactical steps to fostering inclusion, with prompts and promising practices that individuals and organizations can implement to stop subtle acts of exclusion. Finally, we discuss how to facilitate deeper connections at work through inclusive language and appropriate actions. You might be wondering why a gender justice organization is leading training on microaggressions in the workplace. YWCAs across the country work to advance gender equity for women and gender diverse people. Economic empowerment programs at the YWCA look like job search support, training, skills building, micro-credentialing, and settlement services. This means working to help women and gender diverse people from marginalized identities achieve their full potential, making sure they have information to make economic decisions and an overall feeling that when it comes to the economy, there's a place for them. This also means decent work and recognizing that decent work requires labor protections and employment standards. It looks like ensuring equal pay for equal work, pay equity, and benefits like paid sick leave. When people are spending so much of their lives doing paid and unpaid work, we want to make sure that they're doing it in the best possible conditions so that they can have a happy and healthy life. Through our research and work with women in the community, we know that workplaces for women and gender diverse people with marginalized identities are not always happy or healthy. They face barriers, unconscious bias, systemic bias, microaggressions, daily invalidations, and assaults. YWCA Canada promotes inclusion and cultural and psychological safety in the workplace. It does this by ensuring respectful engagement and culturally appropriate interventions that foster trust, acceptance, and belonging. This means a shared commitment to ongoing learning, recognizing our assumptions and biases, and working to dismantle barriers to inclusion. If we are to improve labor market access for women and gender diverse people with marginalized identities, it means working with partner organizations across sectors to build workplaces where people feel and are respected and seen. Shifting mindsets and changing behaviors that cause harm starts with leaders, as individuals changing their minds and behavior. It means being intentionally inclusive, speaking out, and not letting it be acceptable to cause harm. It means creating a shared organizational culture and understanding that promotes inclusion in the workplace consistently and throughout the organization. Leaders need to create spaces where people have psychological safety, where they feel accepted, trusted, respected, and valued for more than their productivity, and where everyone is working to change behaviors to create an organizational culture where everyone can thrive. In the slides ahead, we offer resources that are a solid starting point for organizations and individuals to begin the work of understanding, identifying, and stopping microaggressions. These can take the form of micro-assaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations, and other conscious or covert actions that communicate exclusion and cause harm, often based on identity or membership in a marginalized group, such as gender, race, ethnicity, ability, sexuality, amongst others. Dr. Tiffany Jana and Dr. Michael Barron offer steps that leaders and individuals can take in their book, Subtle Acts of Exclusion: How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions. This presentation is based on their work. One of the most critical aspects of inclusion is that it must happen actively. When we just passively think of ourselves as good people, but don't do anything to actively include others, that creates passive exclusion. Imagine a world full of thoughtful people who consider the impact of their words and actions before releasing them into the universe. In that world, equity becomes reality. Race, gender, class, age, ability, and dozens of other characteristics cease to limit and define people's success. Watch this short video to learn how microaggressions impact people disproportionately and cumulatively.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well-spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins' name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
So pretty. Can
Can I touch it, please?
Can I please?
is fucking annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
The video shows the not-so-subtle consequences of these ongoing acts of exclusion that are often overlooked. Doctors Jana and Barron have rebranded microaggressions to convey their full impact and how they work in ways that are often not discernible to those not directly impacted. They offer the new term, Subtle Acts of Exclusion, or SAE. This, although clunkier than the more widely used term microaggressions, is more useful because it clearly names and describes the situation. SAEs are so called because they appear subtle, they are acts, they serve to exclude. Subtle. They can be hard to identify and difficult to talk about. While they may appear subtle to those not directly impacted, they certainly don't land in subtle ways for those at the receiving end. Some of the subtlety can lead to anxiety when someone can't pick out what is happening and is thus made to question their own experiences. Acts. These are acts that can insult, exclude, or harm. They are things that people say and do. While we may not know the intention of the act, our focus needs to stay on the impact of said act. By shifting our focus in this way, we can avoid unhelpful and unnecessarily labeling of the person who took the action and what their motives might have been, and instead speak directly to the act itself, what was said and done, and productively focus on how to act differently. Exclude. SAEs are a problem for individuals who are being excluded at the moment, and they create and compound exclusion of people with marginalized identities. Subtle acts of exclusion serve to diminish people. They are critical to understand, identify, and address. We need to be intentional about the way that those issues are discussed if we are to make real progress. Using the word microaggression is not as clear. The term communicates that microaggressions are implicit, unspoken messages that are not in our control. It provokes defensiveness, stopping progress or conversation. By saying it is micro, it seems as if it isn't a big deal. It excludes people by making their concerns seem small and unimportant. It can indicate that unless something is overtly aggressive, it isn't inherently violent or invalidating. Framing these acts as subtle acts of exclusion is more accessible and actionable. It creates a path to move forward. It understands that everyone can engage in SAE and that it does not have to be malicious to be harmful. Why do subtle acts of exclusion slip out even when people have good intentions? One of the reasons it's so easy for SAE to slip out when people have good or benign intentions is that we all have unconscious or implicit biases. These are associations, assumptions, and expectations that we hold about certain groups of people without even necessarily being aware of it. Even when we're trying to compliment, be curious, show comfort, or be funny, we may be engaging in acts that serve to exclude. Subtle acts of exclusion communicate a lot, whether it is a statement or a gesture like an eye roll. Doctors Jaina and Baron established a framework in taxonomy to identify that SAEs communicate. It communicates to the person at the stinging end that they are invisible, are inadequate, are not an individual, are not normal, are a curiosity, are a threat, are a burden, and ultimately do not belong. For example, someone may ask a colleague, "So what are you?" or "Where are you from?" The initiator may be thinking that they are just being curious with the question, but the SAEs they are communicating are that the recipient is a curiosity, that they are not normal. Take a moment to pause here and consider a statement that you may have heard or even said yourself. Reflect on that statement or gesture and what it may have conveyed to the person on the receiving end of it. Here are some examples of subtle acts of exclusion that show up often and impact women, gender diverse people, and people with marginalized identities in the workplace. Questions like, "What does your husband do?" makes assumptions about someone's relationship status or sexual orientation and can make someone feel like they are invisible. Asking, "Where are you from?" makes someone feel like a curiosity. Actions like assuming the man is in charge communicates that the woman leader is inadequate in her leadership. Giving a man credit for a woman's previously shared idea renders her invisible. Consistently misgendering a person or refusing to use someone's pronouns says to that person, "You are not an individual." Having only gender-specific bathrooms available in the workplace makes someone feel like a threat or a burden. Making gender jokes and generalizations makes the subject feel they don't belong. Clutching a purse or crossing the street when seeing a black man makes him feel like a threat. Touching a black woman's hair says she is a curiosity. Mispronouncing or mistreating someone's name, not remembering, not trying to get it right, or laughing at it invalidates their identity. Not using a microphone and joking that your voice is loud enough in a meeting makes a person with a hearing impairment feel like a burden. Wishing someone Merry Christmas when they practice a faith other than Christianity or are atheist makes that person feel inconsequential. Asking teammates about their spirit animal or to join you in a powwow dilutes the significance of indigenous cultures and practices. So what can organizations do? As we continue to diversify our workplaces, SAEs become more and more common. Here's what organizations can do to successfully implement policies and systemize procedures to eliminate microaggressions and subtle acts of exclusion. Expect SAEs to happen. When people work closely together and are working to be inclusive, they may be pushing against their comfort boundaries. Communicate the norm and be consistent in your accountability practice. Folks should know where to turn if something does not go well or something isn't resolved. They should know what to expect if an incident is escalated. Encourage codifying anti-SAE policies and systemized procedures. Update company policies from an anti-oppression, anti-racist framework. Practice speaking up. It takes practice for all of us to intervene or not feel defensive when something is pointed out to us. Organizations should set the conditions for conversations about SAEs, provide common language, training, and practice for leaders and employees to be on the same page. When everyone is accountable, then discussions can be easier because there is a habit of responding in productive ways together. What can individuals do? If what you intend to say is to or about a marginalized person or group, it is worth asking yourself a few quick questions in advance. Think about the SAE types and taxonomy presented earlier and whether you may be contributing to one of those inadvertent exclusions. Ask yourself before you speak, is what I'm about to say ask based on a stereotype or assumption about a marginalized group? Is what I'm about to say ask unnecessarily intrusive? Am I overstepping? Is what I'm about to say based on kindness and generosity or the opposite? Do I have the authority, right to tell, ask this person to comply with my request? Is this a good use of my authority, privilege? This means looking at our motives and actions and how to make them less harmful. Some things to consider include, how do I respond in the moment? How do I respond as a witness? How do I step up to be an ally? Jana and Barron offer guidelines for speaking up in a way that holds people accountable with productive, open civil conversations. Organizations should create common language, training, and practice for all leaders and employees so they can be on the same page. As individuals, we are encouraged to speak up safely and productively. This looks like pausing and being aware, exploring together with curiosity, understanding impact first, using the opportunity to grow. Creating a workplace where SAEs are interrupted means that you'll increase feelings of inclusion, build trust amongst colleagues, increase collaboration across teams and through the organization, improve team members' ability to give and receive feedback respectfully, create a culture of interpersonal civility, transparency, and accountability. What keeps individuals from intervening, interrupting, and redirecting SAEs? All too often, people remain silent when they witness or experience an exclusionary or biased interaction with fellow workers. Why the hesitation to speak up? Being motivated to help or create change is not enough when individuals lack the necessary strategies and actions required for further effective interventions. It doesn't always take a grand gesture or training to challenge and confront everyday SAEs. Microaggressions can be disarmed through microinterventions, according to Doral Wing Su, professor of psychology and education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Here are 4 strategies or anti-bias actions to add to our toolkits. 1. Make the invisible visible. When we take a moment to surface the insensitive or offensive comments or actions to the perpetrator's awareness, it may help them recognize prejudice and assumptions even when the intentions are innocent. For example, restating the act can draw attention to what is left unsaid. I think I heard you saying, paraphrase their comments. Is that correct? 2. A more direct way of dealing with SAEs is to disarm and deflect by pointing to the harm or impact and redirecting. If someone were to say, "Oh, you only got the job because you are a," you can step in and say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's not insert any assumptions about why someone was the chosen candidate." Saying, "I know you really care about diversity," acting in this way really undermines those intentions. Or asking for clarification. What makes you think that? 3. One of the most transformative tactics is to educate the perpetrator by engaging them in dialogue without invoking defensiveness. Expressing empathy and compassion can demonstrate that good intentions can sometimes cause harmful impacts. Saying something like, "Okay, I know you meant well, but that really hurt me." Or, "I know you were joking around, but I think Manisha was offended." The first step is signaling the impact. The second step is sharing alternative practices. Something like, "Actually, in my experience," or, "I used to think that too, and then I learned." 4. Seek support when individual efforts are not enough to make institutional change. For instance, when the discriminatory or exclusionary act comes from someone with a stark power differential, like a supervisor or a funder, it may be best handled by seeking support or reinforcement. Reporting to an authority or seeking an advocate may help an individual navigate the best course of action to yield results. In all these interventions, remember to target the perspective, not the person. A word of caution. These approaches may take undue energy and labor from people already marginalized. Where we have privilege, it is important to become active allies. Allyship is about what people do in the moment, but it is also about what organizations do to proactively prevent exclusion from happening or mitigate its harms. Organizations must take the lead to create the conditions to disrupt SAEs and a culture that values diversity and inclusion. Ensure employees know how to recognize inappropriate behavior and SAEs and how to report it. Provide all employees with training at orientation and ongoing on sensitivity and the role of supportive and active bystanders. How to report, including procedures and protections. How to respond to a complaint. Make sure that if employees do report behavior, that it will be dealt with fairly and not swept under the rug, or result in a backlash against themselves or the victim. Inclusive language is a daily practice of communicating intentionally, using unbiased words that acknowledge diversity, convey respect, and support an environment of equitable opportunity. Language shapes human relationships. Using inclusive language honors each person's diverse identity, making them feel valued and empowered to do their best work. Using exclusive, insensitive, or discriminative language can cause them harm. Here are 6 guidelines for inclusive language. Number 1, put people first. Use person-first language. Person with diabetes versus diabetic. It acknowledges people's identities and recognizes that a person is much more than any of their identity descriptors. Second, use universal phrases. Avoid idioms, acronyms, jargon, cultural phrases that may not make sense to all people. Third, recognize the impact of mental health language. When we describe everyday behaviors, moods, characteristics using terms related to mental health diagnoses, this can further perpetuate harm. Avoid using terms that have mental health connotations unless they are used in a medical context. Fourth, use genderless language. Friends, people, instead of guys. Fifth, be thoughtful about the imagery you use. Be sensitive to symbolism. Consider the descriptions and the connotations. Example, black to represent bad, sad, or negative. Blind to represent unknowing, inexperienced, or ignorance. 6. Clarify if you aren't sure. Many people are happy to talk through language that makes them feel respected. Clarify what terms and identifiers they use and feel respected by, but do not expect others to educate you. Do your own research and dig deeper. The Inclusive Language Handbook A Guide to Better Communication and Transformational Leadership by Jackie Ferguson and Roxanne Bellamy is a helpful resource in determining which words and phrases are more or less inclusive. It explores words that are less inclusive, offers words that are more inclusive, and outlines why or the history of these words and phrases that make them so damaging. Let's look at some words together. Some less inclusive words include crazy, nuts, maniac, insane, deranged, or psycho. More inclusive words could be surprising, wild, shocking, absurd, exciting, unreal, remarkable, extraordinary. Using derogatory terms to describe behavior that is surprising or unexpected minimizes and stigmatizes the impacts of real mental health conditions. Another example of a less inclusive word is slave. A more inclusive word would be enslaved people. The reason why? The term slave dehumanizes individuals. The condition of slavery does not define who individuals are as people. Basket case is another example of a less inclusive word. A more inclusive word that could be used is nervous. This term has a negative historic meaning. It originally referred to a person, usually a soldier from World War I, who had lost all 4 limbs and was carried in a basket. Something else we might often hear is no can do. A more inclusive way of saying that is I can't do it. Why is this change important? Originally, it was a way to mock Chinese people who were learning English. So what happens when you discover you have been engaging in acts of exclusion? Because sometimes we can all be a little thoughtless. We all have a role. Here are some things that we can do. A. Apologize. Don't forget that a sincere and timely apology coupled with a correction in behavior can go a long way to improving relationships with those you may have unintentionally hurt. R. Self-reflection is key. Be constantly interrogating your assumptions and behaviors. O. Be open to discussing your attitudes or biases. Don't be defensive. L. Be willing to learn and relearn until you get it right. E. Alongside education, we need experience, exposure to the things you have a bias against to learn more and discover how to correct your actions and assumptions. Crucially, it is important to remember that interpersonal acts and expressions of exclusion are linked to institutional exclusion. Interrupting SAEs are necessary to disrupt systemic bias. Here are some questions and prompts to reflect, explore, and expand the ideas presented in the video. What are some signs that subtle acts of exclusion are present and ongoing in a workplace? These may include diminished productivity, disengagement and absenteeism, lack of contribution in video meetings or conference calls, missed deadlines. As organizations, teams, and individuals, how can you identify and interrupt subtle acts of exclusion? What are some effective ways to create a culture of inclusion? It can be even harder to detect and call out when subtle acts of exclusion happen online rather than in office. It is harder to monitor and respond to a stinging comment or a misplaced compliment on Slack channels and emails. How can a culture of inclusive communication and behavior be created and maintained in remote and hybrid work models? How can you move from subtle acts of exclusion to active allyship? How can you reframe the focus from being bad to being better? To close, we encourage folks to learn more about SAEs. The books we have identified earlier are great resources to move these conversations further, in addition to the resources included in this slide and in the accompanying worksheet. The Micropedia is a resource that offers more insights about subtle acts of exclusion, microaggressions, and their impact. We also invite you to find information that outlines SAEs that are focused on 2S LGBTQIA+, age, class-based, disability, ethnicity, gender, indigenous, race, and religion. Thank you so much for participating in this Move Forward learning module to create inclusion in contemporary work. To continue to learn with us, please check out the rest of the learning modules in this series and join our employers' community of practice to connect with other employment equity champions across the country. Visit ywcacanada.ca/moveforward for more information. Thank you for listening.